It was a rainy afternoon when I decided to clean David's study. It wasn't something I did often since he was very protective of his space, but an inexplicable curiosity pushed me to do it. As I wiped the desk, my gaze drifted toward one of the drawers. It was slightly open, something unusual for someone as meticulous as David. I carefully opened the drawer and found a small golden key. I picked it up, wondering what it might unlock. I looked around until my eyes landed on a larger, heavier drawer that had always been locked. My heart pounded as I inserted the key and turned it. The drawer opened slowly, revealing a black briefcase. I pulled it out and placed it on the desk, noticing it was heavier than I expected. With trembling hands, I opened the briefcase and found a collection of objects that seemed straight out of a horror movie. Handcuffs, masks, and a series of small knives, each with a different engraving. I stepped back, horrified, unable to take my eyes off the contents of the briefcase. What was David doing with these things? I couldn't understand it. My mind filled with questions, each more disturbing than the last. Suddenly, I heard the sound of the front door opening. I slammed the briefcase shut and put it back in the drawer, making sure to lock it again. I left the study just as David walked into the house. Hi, love, you're home early, I said, trying to sound natural. David looked at me with a smile, but his eyes seemed colder than usual. Yeah, work was quiet today. What have you been up to? Nothing out of the ordinary, I replied, hiding my unease. The image of the objects in the briefcase was still etched in my mind. What was my husband hiding? The days following the discovery of the briefcase were unsettling. David, normally punctual and organized, began to show erratic behavior. He came home late from work without warning, and when I asked about his day, his answers were evasive. One night, during dinner, I noticed his gaze was distant. David, are you okay? I asked, trying to hide my concern. Yes, just a bit tired. Work has been exhausting, he replied without looking me in the eye. But it wasn't just exhaustion. David had always been a reserved man, but now he seemed to be hiding something deeper. He started receiving calls late at night and would get out of bed to talk in whispers in the study. One afternoon, when I returned from the supermarket, I found David in the garage. He was meticulously cleaning the trunk of his car. When he saw me, he slammed the trunk shut and forced a smile. Just tidying up a bit, he said, but something in his tone made me doubt. I decided to observe more closely. I noticed his suits started showing signs of wear, something unheard of for someone so careful with his appearance. Additionally, there were marks on his wrists, as if he had been wearing something tight around them. The party continued, but I could barely focus. The accidental revelation by that man had set off an alarm in my mind. I had to find out more about Rick and the secrets David was hiding. The feeling that something dark and dangerous was looming over us was undeniable. A couple of weeks later, we attended a party hosted by one of David's partners. It was one of those elegant and opulent gatherings, full of important people and superficial conversations. I felt out of place, but I did my best to fit in. While chatting with some of the wives, I heard a man nearby mention something that froze me in my tracks. David? Yeah, I saw him a couple of nights ago with Rick, that weird guy. They were at that old warehouse in the industrial district. My mind started racing. Rick. That must be the man I saw with David. I tried not to show my surprise as I approached the group of men. Oh, really? I said with a forced smile. What were they doing there? The man shrugged. Who knows? David has always had his peculiar businesses. My heart raced. What did this man know about David's peculiar businesses? I tried to keep asking without seeming too interested, but the answers were vague and full of insinuations. The party continued, but I could barely focus. The accidental revelation by that man had set off an alarm in my mind. I had to find out more about Rick and the secrets David was hiding. The feeling that something dark and dangerous was looming over us was undeniable. One day, while David was at work, I decided to check his study again. Curiosity and worry were too strong to ignore. I turned on his computer and, after a few minutes of searching, found his email open. What I discovered took my breath away. There were messages from several unknown addresses, each more disturbing than the last. David was exchanging emails with people who shared his dark interests. The topics ranged from clandestine meetings to explicit discussions about their tastes and activities. One of the most recent emails was from someone named Rick, confirming a meeting at the same warehouse where I had seen them. The tone of the messages was cold and calculating, with a clear indication that something more sinister was at play. I printed several of the emails as evidence, my mind spinning with questions and fear. I didn't know what to do with this information, but I knew I couldn't keep ignoring the truth. David was involved in something dark and dangerous, and I couldn't afford to be a passive bystander. A few days later, I went to a local cafe to try to clear my mind. While standing in line, I noticed a young woman with sad eyes and a nervous demeanor. As I looked more closely, I felt like I knew her from somewhere. Suddenly, she approached me and whispered, "You're David's wife, aren't you?" I nodded, surprised. Yes, do we know each other?" "I'm Lisa," she said quietly, glancing around nervously. "We met at your husband's party the other night. I need to talk to you." We sat at a secluded table, and Lisa began to recount her experience. "I met David through some friends. At first, he seemed charming, but soon he showed his true colors. He got me involved in things I didn't want to do, horrible things. I tried to get away, but he threatened me." I felt a knot in my stomach as I listened. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together, and the picture they formed was terrifying. Lisa gave me more details about the encounters and threats, confirming my worst fears. "Be careful," she warned before leaving. "David is more dangerous than you think." That night, when David got home, I decided to confront him. The information I had gathered and Lisa's warning left me no choice. I waited for him in the living room, the printed evidence on the table. "We need to talk," I said firmly as soon as he walked in. David looked at the papers, and his face hardened. "What's this?" he asked, his voice full of menace. "Emails. Messages from Rick. Everything about your activities," I replied, trying to stay calm. David slowly approached, his eyes cold. "You shouldn't have seen that. You shouldn't be doing this," I retorted, standing up. What is going on, David? What have you done?" In a swift movement, David slammed the table, knocking the papers to the floor. "You know nothing. Stay out of my business." I stepped back, scared. "Your business? We're a family. I can't ignore what you're doing." "You better," he shouted, his voice filled with fury. "Because if you don't, you'll regret it." The threat was clear and direct. David turned and left the room, leaving the house in ominous silence. I stood there, trembling, certain that our lives were about to change drastically. External threat. Days after the confrontation with David, I began to notice something disturbing. An unknown man seemed to be following me. At first, I thought it was a coincidence, but it soon became clear it wasn't. I saw him outside the supermarket, then near my office, and finally in my neighborhood. One afternoon, as I walked to my car, the man approached me. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket, and had a piercing gaze. Enjoying your day, Mrs. David? Yeah, he said with a cold smile. I froze, fear coursing through my body. Who are you? What do you want? I asked, trying to maintain my composure. Just a friend making sure you keep your mouth shut, he replied. You know too much. We don't want anyone to get hurt, do we? His warning was clear. I stood there paralyzed as he walked away, his words echoing in my mind. I was caught up in something much bigger than I had imagined, and the threat was real. That night, I decided to search David's study again. If I was going to protect myself, I needed to know exactly what he was doing. As I went through his documents, I found a hidden file on his computer. Opening it, I discovered a detailed plan for an event happening in a few days. The plan included names, places, and dates. David and his associates were planning an act that could endanger many people. There were references to chemical manipulation and access to critical facilities. Everything pointed to a coordinated attack. My heart pounded as I read the details. This wasn't just a dark whim, it was a direct threat to public safety. I knew I couldn't stand by, but I also couldn't go to the police without solid evidence and without putting myself in even greater danger. In my search for more information, I decided to contact Lisa again. We met at a secluded cafe, where I shared what I had discovered. Lisa looked at me seriously. There's something I didn't tell you before, she confessed. David isn't acting alone. He's linked to a dangerous organization, a network of individuals involved in illegal activities. The revelation left me breathless. What kind of organization? I asked. Lisa explained that the group was involved in drug and arms trafficking, among other illicit activities. David isn't just a pawn, she said. He has an important role, which is why he's so involved. The gravity of the situation became clear. I was dealing with something much bigger and more dangerous than I had imagined. I had to act, but any misstep could be fatal. I returned home that night, determined to confront David once more. This time, I was armed with information and the certainty that I had to do something. I waited for him in the living room, with the documents and emails on the table. When David walked in, his face showed a mix of surprise and anger. Again with this? He said disdainfully. Don't underestimate me, David, I responded, my voice firm. I know what you're planning. I know about the organization and the danger they pose. David stared at me, his expression darkening. You have no idea what you're getting into, he said in a low, threatening tone. I know better than you think, I retorted. And I'm not going to let you go through with this. David stepped towards me, his face a mask of rage. And what do you plan to do? Go to the police? Do you think they'll believe you? I don't need them to believe me, I said, showing the evidence. I just need to stop it. If I don't, this evidence will go to the right people. For a moment, there was a tense silence. Then David exploded. You're a fool. You have no idea who you're dealing with, he shouted, knocking the papers to the floor. The fury in his eyes was terrifying, but I stood firm. I don't care. This ends here, David. You're not the man I knew, and I can't let you keep hurting people. David stopped, breathing heavily. Finally, his shoulders slumped, defeated. You have no idea what you've unleashed, he murmured before turning and leaving the room. I knew the battle was far from over, but at least I had taken the first step toward truth and justice. The confrontation with David had left the atmosphere at home tense and charged with uncertainty. I couldn't leave things as they were. One night, while we were having dinner in uncomfortable silence, I decided to press him further. David, we can't keep living with this secret between us. I need the truth. What are you really doing? I asked firmly. David dropped his utensils and looked at me with a mix of fatigue and desperation. You wouldn't understand, but fine, I'll tell you, he finally said. It all started years ago. Rick and his group approached me with promises of power and money. I got involved in their business, but it wasn't what I wanted. Then why keep doing it? I insisted. Because I have no choice, he replied, his voice filled with bitterness. Rick has something on me, something that could destroy me. He's been manipulating me all this time. What kind of things? I asked, feeling like I was just scratching the surface. David looked at me, his eyes filled with a pain I had never seen before. Things that could ruin my life, our life. I've done terrible things, yes, but Rick has pushed me into it. He's the real monster here. As the days went by, I started to notice unsettling changes in our social life. Close friends and family began to distance themselves. Invitations to dinners and social events became increasingly rare. One afternoon, while having coffee with a childhood friend, she looked at me with pity and concern. Are you okay? I've heard rumors about David. Terrible things, she said quietly. What kind of things? I asked, my stomach churning. That he's involved in illegal activities. That he's been doing dangerous and dark things. People are scared, she replied. I realized that the rumors were affecting our reputation. I tried talking to other friends, but their responses were evasive. The community we had lived in for years was starting to see us as outcasts. Even within the family, calls became less frequent. My sister, who had always been my confidant, stopped visiting us. I'm just worried about you, she said during a brief call. I don't want you to get dragged into all this. The loneliness and isolation grew, and with them, my determination to uncover the whole truth and protect my family, no matter the cost. The pressure mounted every day, and not just at home. I started to notice suspicious men hanging around our street, and one night, I received a call that chilled me to the bone. Enjoying your quiet life, Susan? Said a harsh, unfamiliar voice. It would be a shame if something happened to you or your husband if you decide to talk too much. Who are you? I asked, my voice trembling. It doesn't matter who I am. What matters is that you keep quiet. We know where you live, where you work. Stay out of this, and nothing will happen to you, the voice replied before hanging up. Fear became a constant. Every shadow, every unexpected noise made me jump. I knew David was in danger, but now I was too. The threat wasn't just about dark secrets, it was a clear warning that our lives were at stake. I tried talking to David about the call, but he became furious. Do you see what you've done? Now they've involved you too. I told you to stay away from this, he shouted, his eyes filled with desperation. I can't stand by, David, I responded determinedly. If we're going to get out of this, we need a plan. And we need help. The threats were real, and the danger imminent. I knew we had to act quickly, but the question was, how to escape such a dangerous web without losing everything in the process. One afternoon, while I was at home, I received an unexpected visit. It was my cousin Laura, someone I had grown up with and shared many memories with. Her face showed signs of distress and desperation. Laura, what's wrong? I asked, alarmed to see her in such a state. I need to talk to you, Susan. It's about David, she said, her voice breaking. We sat in the living room, and Laura began to recount her story. A few months ago, David approached me at a party. At first, he seemed kind, but then he changed. He took me to a secluded place and forced me to do things, horrible things. I was frozen. The blood drained from my face as I listened to her account. Why didn't you tell me before? I whispered, trying to hold back tears. I was scared. David threatened me. He said if I talked, he would hurt me and my family, Laura replied, sobbing. Anger and helplessness mixed inside me. The man I had loved all my life was a monster, and he had hurt someone so close. I knew I couldn't let this continue. I had to do something to stop him. That night, David came home with a determined expression. Susan, we're leaving. Tonight, he said, throwing a suitcase on the floor. What are you saying? I asked, confused. Everything is falling apart. Rick and his people are cornered. If we don't leave now, we never will. I have fake passports and enough money to last us a while. We're leaving tonight, he explained urgently. I looked at the suitcase and then at David. The decision I had to make was monumental. I could turn him over to the authorities and end all this, or follow him and protect him, despite what he had done. And what about me? My life here? I asked, searching for some sign of remorse in his eyes. There's no time for that, Susan. If you stay, you'll be in danger. You have to decide now, he replied. I decided to follow David, at least until we were safe. However, I knew I couldn't leave things as they were. We headed to the place where Rick and his group met for one last showdown. We arrived at the abandoned warehouse, and the tension in the air was palpable. Rick's men were there, armed and ready. Rick smiled when he saw us. Well, look who decided to show up, he said with a mocking smile. This ends here, Rick, I said, my voice firm. Leave David alone. We know enough to destroy you. Rick laughed. Do you really think you can threaten me? David stepped forward. Rick, leave her out of this. I'll do whatever you want, but don't touch her. Rick raised an eyebrow. Do you really think you can negotiate with us now? You're finished. Before I could react, a fight broke out. I used all my courage and wit to protect David. In the end, we managed to escape, but we knew the battle wasn't over. With Rick and his men after us, the danger was imminent. David was hurt, and his condition worsened by the minute. I knew we couldn't keep running indefinitely. I needed to take desperate measures to ensure our survival. I found temporary refuge at an old family friend's house. While David rested, I made calls to the few people I still trusted, seeking help and protection. I knew we needed a safer plan to escape Rick and his organization. One night, while caring for David, the back door burst open. Rick and his men had found our hideout. I knew this was a fight for our lives. In the final showdown, Rick revealed something that left me stunned. David has been lying to you, Susan. He was the one who handed over your friends, gave us information to keep his position, Rick said with a malicious smile. I turned to David, looking for a denial. But he lowered his gaze.
I'm sorry, Susan.
I did terrible things to keep us safe, he confessed. The betrayal was a devastating blow. But at that moment, something changed in David. Rick, if you want someone, take me. Let her go, he said with determination. Rick seemed to consider the offer. A very well. But if you try anything, she will die. With the help of our few allies, I managed to secure David's release and dismantle part of Rick's network. But the price was high. David had betrayed my trust, but he had also shown he was willing to sacrifice himself for me. After the storm, David and I found a small refuge far from everything. Our life would never be the same. The weight of his actions and partial redemption weighed on us. Every day was a struggle to rebuild our relationship and our lives. David was determined to redeem himself, to be a better person. And I, despite everything, decided to give him a second chance, although trust was still fragile. Reflecting on everything we had been through, I knew the future wouldn't be easy. But there was a small spark of hope. We had survived the worst, and somehow, that made us stronger. The new beginning was a path filled with uncertainty, but also with possibilities. And although the past would always be present, we were determined to forge a different future, together.